I've been teaching React for years now, and throughout that entire time, I've seen tons of different mistakes that developers have made. But there are three mistakes that stand out above the rest that I see nearly every single beginner React developer make. In this video, I'm going to show you what those are and how you can fix them so you don't run into those same problems. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And to get started, I want to go over the very first mistake, which is by far the most common mistake that I see React developers make, and it's actually a mistake with how you understand JavaScript. So there's code here is quite a bit complicated. There's a lot of code going on. Right in here, I have three separate functions being defined. We're just going to kind of ignore those for now and move down to the bottom where I have my JSX. And those three functions are being used inside of three different event handlers. The very first event handler is on our form, and it's just passing the function along to onSubmit. So onSubmit is being set directly to this handle submit function that I've created. Down here, we have an onClick function event handler, and inside of here, I'm actually passing it a function which calls my print function with some number variable. So this is so far two different ways to pass events and functions along to event listeners. And then finally, in this third option, I have another onClick event handler, but this one I'm calling a function and passing that result along as my onClick. So I've used three different ways of passing information on to my different event handlers. And the number one mistake I see beginners making is not realizing the difference between these three different techniques and mixing up which one they use inside of different scenarios. So just to show you that everything works as we expect, if I click submit, you can see it'll print out submit as well as whatever is inside my text box. If I click print 1, 2, or 3, it just prints the number as well as the text print. And then if I do double 1, 2, 3, you can see it just prints double whatever that number is as well as the text double. So everything is working even though I'm using three different techniques. So the very first technique I want to go over is this one up here where I just pass along the name of the function. If we come up here, we have a handle submit function. It takes in some type of E argument, which is our event. And in here, we're just preventing the default and then doing that simple console log. Now, the reason that it works when I pass along the function like this, where I just pass it the actual name of the function, is because onSubmit essentially expects you to pass it a function as its argument. And handle submit is a function. So if I pass handle submit to onSubmit, what's going to happen is it's going to call my function handle submit, and it's going to pass along all of the information that you would normally get when you call onSubmit, which in our case is this event argument right here. So if you pass it just in the name of a function like this, you're essentially just saying use this function and call this function as if it was any other function that you passed to onSubmit. The concept that confuses a lot of people when they're first getting started with React or even JavaScript for that matter is that you can pass functions around as if they were anything at all. And you just have to realize that functions act just like variables and that you can define them as different values. You can pass them to functions, return them from functions, do whatever you want with them. I actually have an entire video covering that concept, which really solidifies the mistake that people make in this section. I'll link it in the cards and description if you want to go more in depth into how function passing works. Also, I'm going to make sure I go through the rest of these two examples, and I'm going to go over exactly which ones you would use and when. That way you have a better idea of why you would use specific examples of this. So we move on to onClick here. This one's a little bit different because instead of passing it just our print function, instead I'm passing it a function which calls print for us. So the important thing here is that whenever you use an event listener inside of React, you need to make sure you pass it a function. In our case up here, we're passing it a function because our function is essentially just a variable and we're passing that variable along. Here, we're defining a function in line, so of course we're passing it a function. So we're automatically checking that box. That's the only thing that really matters. And this function is just calling print and it's passing along whatever number inside of our array we're in. And you can see all that does is log the number. It's super straightforward. The most confusing of these though is this third example where I have this doubler function. I'm calling a function and then passing the return value from that function to onClick. This is where most people make mistakes because what they would do is they would do something like this with print, where they just say print number like this, and they don't actually pass it a function because print number, as you can see, returns nothing. It doesn't have any return value, so currently our onClick does nothing. And when I save, you're gonna notice immediately it actually prints out into my console 1, 2, and 3. And that's because what happens is when it's going through my JSX, it calls array.map, it's going to loop through each one of these, and then it calls this code. And inside the code, it's saying, okay, set my key to this number. And then it's saying, okay, onClick, call this function. So it calls print with our number. That's why it's logging out 3 times in here. And then take the return value of that and set it to my onClick. So you'll notice when I click, it does nothing because print doesn't return anything. So it means our onClick has no value at all. This is the number one mistake that I see people making. So here, this just needs to be a function to make sure that this works. But why does this work down here when I'm passing it the return value of a function? The reason for that is if we look at this function actually returns a function from it. That's why this works. So this is returning to us a function, and we're just using that function right here. That's essentially the same as if we just took this code, copied it, and we pasted it right inside of here. These two are exactly the same. You can see they both do the exact same thing. And that's because it's just returning a function. So when we call doubler like this, it's just going to return to us a function which we can use, and that function is just going to return, or I'm sorry, console log, double whatever the number we passed into it is. So like I said, the most important thing to understand about this entire section of event handlers inside of React is that you just need to make sure you pass them a function, whether it's a variable like this, a hard-coded function inline, or it's going to be something that returns a function. As long as you're passing it a function, that is what matters. And you just need to think, okay, what happens when my code runs? Okay, well, it's going to call this function. Does this function actually return a function, or do I need to wrap it inside of a function like this in the case of print up above? So now, when would you use these different scenarios? The easiest one to understand is passing along a function like this, where you just give it the name and pass it along like that. The time that you would want to use this is twofold. The first is going to be when you actually want to use the event argument or whatever argument is being returned. It's almost always an event. If you want to use that inside the function you're defining, passing along the function like this works just fine. It's essentially the same thing as if I wrote out this. These two do exactly the same thing. It's just calling one extra function. You can see when I click submit, it still works just fine. So if you want to just use that event argument, just passing it along like this is perfectly fine. Now, if you don't care about the event argument, for example, my function was like this, it didn't take in any arguments at all, well, in that case, this will work just fine for you as well. If I just get rid of all this code and I just replace it with something that doesn't care about the event, I could just say console.log hi. When I click submit, of course, it's submitting because it doesn't actually prevent the default, but as you can see, it's calling that function for us, which is all that matters. So if you care about the event argument itself, or if you don't have any arguments at all, passing along your function like this makes total sense. Now, the other scenario where you're passing it a function, which is going to call another function for you, this is really great when you need to pass along custom data. In our case, we need to pass along this custom number. And this custom number we cannot get in any other way other than by calling a function to pass that along. Because if we tried to do this, we just passed along our print function like this, well, that's not going to work because it doesn't have the number that we need. And we can't call it like this because, as you know, this is going to call print immediately, and then our onClick isn't going to have any value. So in our case, we need to wrap this inside of a function, and all we're essentially saying is, hey, call this function, and all it allows me to do is just make sure I call print with the correct number. So if you need to use data that's local to wherever you're calling your function, for example, here we have this local data inside of this loop, it's not accessible anywhere else, then generally passing a function along like this is going to be what you want to do. Now, this third example of using a function that returns a function, honestly, it's not something you're going to use very much at all. I just put it in here more so for completeness, but there's a couple libraries out there and some niche use cases for why you would actually want to do this. But for 99% of your use cases, you're going to be either just passing along a function like this, or you're going to be doing an inline function like this. Almost never are you going to be dealing with a function that returns another function for you, but if you are, at least you know that this is something that you can do if you need to. Now, I know that last example took a long time to go through. This one's going to be much quicker, and it's actually a mistake that I see all levels of React developer make, not just beginners. And that is not understanding exactly how JSX works with falsy values. So normally if you have a falsy value and you're doing a double ampersand like this, you could do something that's called short circuiting. So that's what's going to happen is this value is false. It's not going to run the code after it, which just allows you to do essentially an if statement inside your JSX. If you're not familiar with short circuiting, I'm going to link a video I've done on it in the cards and description for you. But essentially, like I've said, if this value comes out as true, then it's going to evaluate the code afterwards. If it comes out as false, it's not going to run the code afterwards, which means that this code never gets outputted. So in our case here, as long as our array.length is not falsy, which means as long as it's not 0, you can see that it's going to print this out. So you can see our length is 2, that's fine. Our length is 1, that's fine. And now when we have a length of 0, you're going to notice something interesting happens. First of all, this does not render out, which is exactly what we expect, but we get this weird 0 showing up on our screen. The reason for that is because array.length returns 0, and 0 is considered falsy in JavaScript. So it says, okay, this is a falsy value. I'm done evaluating. Don't do anything else. Just return whatever I have. So it's returning 0. Essentially, we're just taking all of this code and we're replacing it with the text 0. That's what this is doing. And the way that JSX works is it'll render anything at all that you put on the screen. So you can see that the 0 is being rendered out, but the things it will not render are false. So if you pass false, it renders nothing. If you pass null, it renders nothing. Or if you pass undefined, you can see that renders nothing. So those are the only 3 values that render nothing to the screen. If you have any other value, it's going to render out to the screen. So if we go back to our example where we had our array.length, our array length is 0, which means it's rendering 0 to our screen. This is a mistake I see all the time in code bases, and it's actually a really hard one to see and to be able to catch, because a lot of times this tiny little 0 that shows up is going to be so small you don't even notice it on your page. It'll be like in the footer or something, super small, so it's really easy to miss. And if you do miss it, it's something that goes along to your users, and it's just a bad user experience in general. Luckily, the fix for this is incredibly easy. Anytime that you're using this double ampersand inside your code, you need to make sure that you're only ever returning false, null, or undefined. So in our case, we should explicitly say, is this equal to 0? And in our case, we're technically wanting to check if it's not equal to 0. So now you can see that that 0 has gone away, and as soon as we start adding values into our array, they're printing out just fine. But when we have nothing in our array, this actually evaluates to false, because we're saying, is our length not equal to 0? It is equal to 0, so this returns false for us. It's essentially the same as just doing this. And now if we do that, you can see it prints out nothing to our screen. So anytime that you're doing this short circuiting, make sure you only ever return null, undefined, or false, or you could have weird bugs showing up in your code, and 0 is the main way that you'll do that. This is why, let's say I have a user variable. We'll just say user is equal to name Kyle, just like that. Doesn't really matter. Whoops, there we go. And we just come in here, we could say like user and then we could just print out, for example, user.name, whatever, it doesn't matter. There we go. Save that, you can see that it prints out Kyle. And if for some reason our user didn't exist, like it was null, you can see it prints out nothing at all. Now this is technically okay, but if for some reason user ever became like a value of 0 or something like this, you're gonna notice you get a bug. This is why always when I'm using the ampersand short circuiting, I always like to make sure I check against something. Like if it's not equal to null, then do something. That way we get rid of that potential 0 issue. I just make sure I always do this. Same thing with like empty strings and other stuff like this. It just makes your code a little bit more robust, and it's going to make sure you avoid any potential errors. Now this next mistake is one that I see people make all the time, and it actually sometimes won't even throw any errors for you. So it can become really difficult to debug, and you may ingrain this in you. So even if you're an intermediate or more advanced React developer, you still may be making this mistake. And that is not properly understanding how to update state when you're using the existing state. So let's take a really quick look here. I actually have 2 points that I'm going to make in this tip. This first one is a little bit more beginner focused, and the second one is going to be for any skill level. So if we look at this code real quick, you can see here that we just have an array in our state, and we have two functions, one to add a number to the start, one to add a number to the end, and I have a button that just adds the number 0 to the beginning and the end, and then we're just logging out our array down here so we can really understand how state updates work. So if I come in here and I click add 0 to start and end, you'll notice down here in my console log, it put the 0 at the start and at the end, just like I expect. But up here, it hasn't actually made any changes or updated my component. And I can keep adding a 0 to the beginning, and you can see it keeps adding longer and longer, arrays here, but it's never updating my state up in the top section. And the reason for that is because of how I'm managing my state. You can see here, I'm actually mutating my state. And in React, this is definitely not allowed. State in React must be immutable, which means you cannot change it in any way at all. That way, React knows that you've actually updated your state, because the way React actually re-renders your component is based off of the referential value of your thing. And I have a whole video on reference versus value. I'll link in the cards and description if this confuses you. But essentially, an array references a specific piece of memory. And that piece of memory, you can make changes to your array, but it doesn't change that piece of memory that it's actually referencing. So that's always pointing to one particular spot in memory. And if you add or remove a value from your array, it doesn't change where that array points to. It doesn't change what the reference of that array is. So when React looks at this and says, hey, is your array different? It says, nope, it still points to the exact same place as it did before. So it assumes your array has not changed, even though, as you can see here, we're adding numbers to the beginning and end, but it just doesn't know that those changes are being made. So the number one thing you need to know for a fact is do not mutate your state. And here we're obviously doing that. So what we need to do to change this code is we could do something really simple. We can just put this inside of a spread operator. That's going to create a brand new array for us. And here you can see I've put my number at the front of the array. I'll just copy this down here, and I'm going to move the number to the end of the array for this one. There we go. So now at least I'm properly mutating my state, so it should update for me. So if I click add 0 to start and end, you're going to notice it's mostly working. You can see I have a 0 being added to the end, but no 0 being added to the start. Also, something really important you'll notice is this console log still prints out 1, 2, and 3. And this is actually going to clue you in on the reason why this doesn't actually work as you expect. So if we look at our code here, what we're doing is we're adding a number to the start, we're adding a number to the end, and then we're logging out our array. Inside of add number to start, we're not mutating our array never changes. Same thing here, we're not mutating our array. That was what was causing the previous problems. So when we get down here to our console log, our array has not changed at all. That's why it still prints out 1, 2, 3. That makes sense. We didn't mutate it, so obviously it's not going to change. And then what happens with React is after you do all your state changes, it batches them all together and then it re-renders your entire component. So now it's re-rendering my component with the new state value, which in our case is 1, 2, 3, 0. So now if I were to click add 0 to start and end, the value it prints out will actually be 1, 2, 3, 0. And as you can see, that's exactly what I get being printed out down here. All of that essentially is to show you that when you call setArray like this, it doesn't actually change your array variable. This array variable never changes at all. It's immutable. So that means when you call setArray, it doesn't update your array variable, and your array variable will not change until the next time your component renders. So when we come through here and we add a number to the start, what I'm saying is I'm saying set my array to a new value, and that new value is essentially 0, 1, 2, 3. That's what my new array is. But this array variable right here, array, is still equal to 1, 2, 3. I haven't actually changed it. So when we get down here to add number to end, which is what we call second, our array here is still 1, 2, 3, so we add a number to the end. So essentially we're saying our new state should look like this, because it's taking our array, which is 1, 2, 3, and adding 0 to the end. So what's happening is first React says, okay, change state to 0, 1, 2, 3. And then it's saying, okay, now change it to 1, 2, 3, 0. And this one happens first, so it changes your state to 0, 1, 2, 3. And then immediately after that, it changes it to 1, 2, 3, 0. And it does both of these at the exact same time before re-rendering your component, because you call them one after the other. If you do multiple state calls back to back to back, what happens is React batches them all together and only re-renders your component once. So in the end, what happens is this one acts like it never even happened at all. And that's because this second state update right here is just overriding the value entirely, so it's not taking into account any of the changes that we made up here. So how do we get around this problem? Well, that is by using the function version of setState. So whenever you set state, you can either pass it a value, which just hard codes the value to exactly that, or you can use a function which allows you to use the previous value to update the new value. So anytime, and I mean any time that you're updating state where you are using the current value of the state to get the new value of the state, you need to be using the function version instead of this normal version. So right here, we're using our current array value to get the new one, so we need to pass it a function instead. So here we have a function, and inside of this function, we get the current value of our array. So we're just going to call this current array. And this is whatever the most updated version of our array is. Now what I can do here is return, just taking our current array, we'll put the number at the very front of this. So the way that this function works, we just give this a quick save here, is it takes in whatever my current value is, and whatever you return is going to be the new value that it's going to be. So it's just saying, I'm using the current value and updating it to this new value. If you're unfamiliar with this function version, I have a full video on this useState hook, as well as a completely free React Hook Simplified course, which covers every hook, including useState. I'll link them in the cards and description down below for you. So if we go along and we do the exact same thing for add number to end, all I need to do is swap this to put my number at the end here instead. And now when we give this a quick save, give it a refresh, you're going to notice when I click add 0 to end and start, it puts a 0 at the beginning and a 0 at the end, and our array value still doesn't change until after our component fully re-renders. If I move this log up here, for example, give this a quick refresh, you can see it says 1, 2, 3. If I click add to 0, you can now see that the zeros have been added to the beginning and the end. And if you're confused why it's logging out twice, this is because of strict mode in React. I also have a full video on that. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But essentially, to explain what's happening real quick in depth, first we call setArray right here, and our current array has a value of 1, 2, 3, because it has not been changed yet. So it takes that 1, 2, 3 and adds a 0 to the beginning of it. Now, when we get down to this next function version, it calls this function with the most up-to-date version of our state. And in that case, our most up-to-date version is 0, 1, 2, 3, because we got that value from here. So now it's taking that value from here and is using that new most up-to-date value, and it's just putting a 0 onto the end of it, and that's going to be our newly updated state value. And again, the reason that our old way didn't work when we were doing this is because this array value right here is immutable. It never changes. It's always going to be the same until your component re-renders the next time. So no matter how many times we try setting our array, the setArray, like we did this 1,000 times, it doesn't matter. The last one is going to override all of the previous ones that you call, which is why, again, if you're using the current state value, you must use the function version instead of this normal version. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love my React Simplified course. It covers everything you need to know from an absolute beginner in React all the way to more advanced concepts in React. So if you're struggling with any of these beginner mistakes, or you just want to make sure you don't make any of these mistakes, you're going to want to check out that course because it covers everything you need to know about React. Also, I have a completely free React Hook Simplified course. I'll link in the description too. It covers every single React hook out there and is great if you have a little bit more experience in React and you're just looking to level up on all the different hooks out there. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.